Good evening, everyone. I am Michelle Griego, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Colorado Hispanic Chamber of Commerce CBS4 Denver Public Schools Board of Education Candidate Forum. Right now, we are going to get started with District 3 and talk to the two candidates in District 3. I want to give each candidate 30 seconds to introduce yourself and tell why you are running for the board, and we'll start with you.
I'm Mike DeGuire, and I'm running in District 3 for the Denver School Board because I believe we need the necessary new leadership to address the changing, challenging times that we are experiencing in education today. I've been a principal for 28 years. I've also lived in District 3 for over 20 years, and I'm the proud father of a counselor in Denver as well as a grandson in Denver who attends the school. I know that we can do more things in Denver to make changes that we need to make that will help improve our student learning as well as our work conditions for all of our employees, and I'm pleased to be here this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Dr. Carrie Olson, and I'm the current president of the Denver Public Schools Board of Education, and I was elected in 2017 to serve. And I'm running for re-election in Denver Public Schools because I believe we need a career teacher on the board. I taught in Denver Public Schools for 33 years. My daughter attended Denver Public Schools, and I've dedicated my life to strong public schools and DPS. I think we need consistent leadership as we move out of the pandemic into a new era with a new superintendent on the Denver Public Schools Board of Education. We need somebody who's focused on teachers and students, y alguien que sea bilingüe. Thank you for having me here tonight.
The first question will come from my colleague, Jesus Sanchez Melean, who is an editor and co-owner of a Colorado newspaper and has been working for as a journalist in Colorado for the last 10 years. Jesus?
Okay, this is for Carrie. What does mean for you the idea of equity? And then, according with your experience, to what extent the budgeting process became the main obstacle for providing equitable education in Denver?
May I repeat just to be sure I understood? So what is equity?
For you?
And for me?
Yes.
And then how does the budget reflect equity?
No. To what extent became an obstacle for providing an equitable education?
I believe that equity...
Or if the budget is also an opportunity for providing an equitable education.
I believe equity in education, it means not just the absence of racism and bias, but deliberate systems that are put in place throughout all of our schools to ensure that all of our students and our staff receive an equitable educational experience. And that's different for each school. I think back to my time as a teacher at West High School or at Kepner Middle School. Equity in education looked different for the students that I served who came here as immigrants and needed strong education in their native language and in English. So it varies according to each school. And I think the budget is an opportunity to provide equity in education. And we need to listen to our school leaders and our teachers and our families in our schools to understand what they need to provide equitable education. And as the board, we need to provide oversight for how that's playing out in each school.
Do you like to change something in the budgeting process to guarantee more equitable education?
I think that we're at a time of opportunity in Denver Public Schools. As Dr. DeGuire referenced, we're at a time where we can change things in DPS. I think we're coming out of the pandemic with new ideas, with different ways of looking at our schools. How can we better fund our schools so that they all have what they need, so that we have strong mental health supports in our schools, so we have paraprofessionals that are in our schools that can help our students learn, that we have counselors and psychologists and social workers, that we have a well-funded classroom, that we have well-funded libraries. And it's a time for us to do a forensic audit of our budgeting processes to see how we can better fund our schools and our classrooms.
The next question comes from Fernando Sergio, who is the news director and radio host for Radio Que Bueno.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. Mike, how will you balance the needs and priorities of a diverse community, including teachers, administrators, families, students, community members with different opinions and thoughts on what's best for students? How would you bring them all together?
I think it's really important to listen to the voices of our community as well as all the people who work in the district. I've had that experience working in 5 different schools where there were different points of view each time when we had our challenges and our vision that we were setting for our schools. It's really important to make sure that you understand where people are coming from in terms of their viewpoints and what they bring to the table in terms of the conversation. That takes time, it takes listening, and it takes an intentional way to make sure that we're all talking about the same issues. We need to make sure that we understand what the concerns are from our parents, from our educators, as well as from our community members, so that we can be able to include their voices as we're making decisions. This has to be planned. It has to be systematic. It can't be random. It can't be done in an ad hoc fashion. It has to be done systematically and carefully. We need to make sure that we're listening to what their intentional goals are so that we can include those goals and their hopes for their children and for their community in the final decision-making process that happens. We have ways to do that now with our CSCs, and I would encourage us to include those groups in our decision-making process as we set a new vision for DPS.
Carrie, I want to ask you, the district recently welcomed a new superintendent, very recently. What would be your expectation, or what is your expectation of this superintendent, and what are the qualifiers for his success?
When we hired Dr. Marrero, we were intentional in how we went about looking for the qualities from a superintendent based on what we were hearing from our community. I led the most inclusive superintendent search process in the history of Denver Public Schools. We had 3 finalists that were interviewed by 71 community members, and we had countless focus groups and individual interviews listening to what people had to say about what they wanted to see in our next superintendent. And they wanted someone who was grounded, as he says, in the student in the chair, not the label on the door, to think about how can all of our students experience success. So my expectations for him is that he's going to continue to lead, thinking about, as he likes to say, little Alexi, as he thinks of himself as a young Latino growing up in New York and what he needed, and then being out in the community. I think he's proven that since he got here. He started meeting with many people in our community, and just to listen and learn from people and hear what does it mean to be leading in Denver Public Schools, and then to act on that, as I think we saw him with the small schools resolution. He decided to put a pause on it because after meeting with many people, he realized that we needed more community engagement.
Total K through 12 district enrollment in DPS is forecast to decline by 6% by 2025. Several factors are at play here, including declining birth rates in the city, as well as the rising cost of housing. We know that's getting more expensive. The declines will be most significant in elementary and middle school. The largest declines are forecast to happen in Montbello, Southwest, and your district, Central Denver. The prospect of closing or consolidating schools generates a lot of emotion and anxiety. I'm sure you're already hearing from a lot of concerned community members. How would you manage the process of ensuring a realignment of resources in a time of declining enrollment, and that it does not affect the quality of education students are receiving? I'll send that question to you.
The small schools resolution that was passed in June was premature, in my opinion. I realize that we have to look at the change in enrollment and what's happening in terms of our gentrification throughout the city. However, 2 of the factors that were recommended to the board by the district staff included the concerns around the pandemic, where we'd lost students, as well as the fact that some of our preschool and kindergarten students were actually choosing not to attend Denver Public Schools. We need to think carefully about the whole issue of closing or consolidating schools, because this impacts our entire community. It doesn't just impact those areas that you mentioned. We have to think about the way we're budgeting for our small schools and make sure that we're providing the necessary resources and the financial supports that they need, as well as the mental health and social and emotional supports and academic needs that they have. This issue of small schools and consolidation of schools is one that needs to be studied carefully, and the entire community needs to be part of that process so that they understand what's at stake here. We should not be considering closing schools or consolidating schools when we have ways that we can use our budget differently, because small schools can be a wonderful, thriving experience for many of our communities.
I want to send that question to you as well. How would you manage the process of ensuring a realignment of resources in a time of declining enrollment and ensure that it does not affect the quality of education students are receiving?
That's one thing that's been on my mind, especially as I looked at the list of schools that were recommended to start having these small school conversations, because I noticed many of them were transitional native language. So that means that there are a lot of students who receive Spanish instruction until they learned enough English, or they were dual language where they were learning both. And I'm really concerned about the effects that that would have on a population that already isn't receiving the quality of education that they need. So I think that what we need to do is to continue to work with the communities. I know principals have already begun talking about their ideas for how a group of schools that are close in a neighborhood, how they could combine to make sure that they have strong educational outcomes for especially their transitional native language students who are multilingual learners. I think we need to rely on the school leaders, teachers, and the community to hear what ideas they have.
Okay, I want to thank Mike DeGuire and Dr. Carrie Olson for talking with us tonight. I know that was a very quick round, but we got some questions in and some really important answers that the community wants to hear. So I want to thank you.